What is religious trauma syndrome? Well, religious trauma syndrome is a result of a spiritual or religious abuse situation, normally at the hands of an authoritarian religious figure whose abuse of religious doctrines for their own self-serving ends causes trauma. Essentially, being a member of a cult or being brought up in a cult. Religious trauma can lead to individuals believing that they're inherently bad or they're morally corrupt, to the point that it detrimentally affects their self-worth and their self-esteem, and eventually leads to feelings of extreme shame and guilt. Now, religious trauma normally occurs in response to a twofold trauma situation. There's the feelings of guilt and shame, which are generated through the doctrine by the religious authority figure in a controlling religious environment, and then the shaming by former friends or associates or even close family for leaving the community, leaving the religious community. The choice to leave may, of course, also be accompanied by, dire financial or social consequences. Maybe they've grown up within this very strict religious environment and they don't actually have life skills that can be transferred to the outside world. So, of course, breaking away from rituals and beliefs that you've held for such an incredibly long time is in and of itself a very traumatic experience. Now, there are many and varied symptoms associated with religious trauma, far too many to be listed here because they change from individual to individual. But recovering from religious trauma starts firstly with recognizing that it occurred, and then building a support system and readjusting your orientation away from your past and looking towards the future. And of course, getting trauma support therapy is very important as well. Now, having said all of that, my understanding is, and I could be wrong here, but my understanding is that clinicians and researchers are currently shying away very much from actually defining religious trauma as a syndrome, simply because labeling things as a syndrome is quite out of date. Basically, the term comes from a time when, they wanted to pathologize literally everything. They wanted everything to fall neatly into a little box. And so things were labeled without proper clinical research or psychological justification. Now, in order to be a syndrome, you would have to present with a cluster of symptoms that would replicate across the majority of people presenting with it. And something like religious trauma, this simply isn't the case, because it presents in very individualized ways. In my own opinion, religious trauma is just that. It's trauma. It doesn't fit neatly into a little box, and it certainly doesn't present in the same way in everyone. And again, in my own opinion, religion has a huge amount religion has a huge amount to answer for, in my own opinion, because these radicalized, these incredibly radical religious sects and cults, primarily on the Christian right, do an incredible amount of psychological damage, So anyway, that's religious trauma.